We also discussed some of the myths of gaming, and two of them that were just so eye-opening to me is that the average gamer is 35 years old, and 45% of them are women. I just found that fascinating because we just have this stereotype image in our mind that it's young boys.
Over the years, only as we've led churches, we get questions on stuff like this. Mm-hmm. Do you let your kids play blank? Yeah. How long do you let them play blank?
Yeah, all the time.
It's a thing that ministry families are on their heels, not on their toes, trying to figure out.
Another thing Drew talked about was loving the kid that you have been given, not the child that you thought you were going to be given. And just how that plays out when you have a child who maybe you thought was going to be athletic, but is not. Or you thought was going to be musical, but isn't. And so just how to love that child. It was fascinating.
We're getting to know our neighbors, and I'm sitting by one of my neighbors, and he begins to just openly share with me the struggle he has with his high school son. All he wants to do is game. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't know how to relate to him anymore. He doesn't know how to connect with this kid. He doesn't do games. He doesn't understand games. So this is not just something Christians are battling with. Everybody who's a parent is trying to navigate and figure this out. So welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into all this.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been writing about video games for over 10 years now, I guess. And I think it started when I've always kind of been a gamer. There were times when I decided it was something I shouldn't be doing. Like when I was in seminary, I hardly played because I was like, I need to be studying the things of God. And but when I graduated and had a little bit more time on my hands, I got back into it. And I realized that no one was writing. That sounds arrogant. Very few people were writing thoughtfully from a Christian perspective about video games. It was all the church was either sort of thumbing their nose at games, ignoring them, or kind of demonizing them. And so I thought, there's a space rife for thoughtfulness. And so I started writing a lot about it, and ended up getting connected with a ministry called Game Church, where we would go to video game conventions and actually look for ways to point people to Jesus. We had this gamer Bible, and it was Jesus with an Xbox 360 controller on the cover and a headset, which sort of dates that ministry a little bit. But we would just go pass out these gamer Bibles, and it was the Gospel of John with some gamer themed commentary in it. And then Game Church some things happened and that ministry changed. And so some friends and I had the idea of starting our own ministry to geeks and nerds and gamers. And we broadened it beyond video games, and we called it Love Thy Nerd. And so about 4 years ago, I co-founded a ministry to geeks and gamers called Love Thy Nerd. And so it's not just been writing about it. It's been in the trenches, looking for ways to build relationships with gamers. And so, and I've written for dozens of different websites trying to help people parse why video games are not evil, but actually can be played to the glory of God if we approach them thoughtfully and carefully. I'm not here to say that video games are always wonderful. We need to be very discerning as parents, especially about what we let our kids play and all those kinds of things. But yeah, it's been a passion project for years is the short answer.
Yeah. One of the things that Lindley and I talk about is how pastors' kids often have to know all the answers to Bible trivia. There's an expectation of them to be a certain way. And just by using the category, Love Thy Nerd, I'm interested in what you mean by that term. What in your mind is a nerd?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and gosh, it can be so broad because you have car nerds and sports nerds these days. It's not a pejorative anymore. It's not a bad word. People love it these days. It's sort of been really embraced. But at Love Thy Nerd, we're really focused on people who are into sort of nerd or geek culture. So when we use it, we think of video games, comic books, anime, board games, Dungeons and Dragons, which, by the way, Dungeons and Dragons is more popular now than ever before, and it's 60-year history. So wow. It's in its own sort of
There's a whole subculture out there.
Oh yeah.
That gravitates around those kinds of things you just described. We know a lot of kids that fall in that category.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to talk about because it's such a big deal. And all of us are far more influenced by nerd culture than we think. I mean, you think about the explosion of Stranger Things. Not here to endorse that, but that's been, and that's all about Dungeons and Dragons and nerd culture. That's what that show's kind of. That's the the context of that show. Or you think about the Marvel universe being as massive as it is.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about something in your book. So on page 16, it's kind of a list of some myths of what people, what we assume is the average gamer. And I mean, I am going to be completely honest, because that's the way I always am and get myself in trouble. When we began this, I just said, I mean, how big of a deal is this? Because we're really talking about like middle school, high school boys. Now, but I would say that we are getting more and more feedback from young families who, like, ministry couples are getting married and the guy is addicted to video games and she was not prepared, that kind of thing. But so some of your statistics say the average gamer is 35 years old, which I found was fascinating. But this is my most interesting. It said in 2021, women made up 45% of all gamers in the United States. And this was an increase from 41% the year before. That is so crazy to me. So really, it's a unisex situation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the way I like to put it these days is it's more likely that you are a gamer than not. And I think some of that comes from, like, we need to reframe what we think of when we say you're a gamer. Because, I mean, anybody who plays games regularly is a gamer. So if you're really into Wordle,
I love Wordle.
See, you're a gamer. You didn't even know.
Every day.
Without the Wordle.
Yes.
Yeah. Or if you're really into Clash Royale or whatever it is, like, but there's tons of games that are not necessarily like hardcore games that people are playing regularly, and so we're all immersed in this. Video games are influencing us in so many ways that we don't even realize. So, 220 million Americans play video games regularly, so that's about 2/3 of our population. The vast majority of American households own a console dedicated to gaming. We all have cell phones. And so, if you're at dull moments during the day pulling your cell phone out and playing a match 3 puzzler, like, you're a gamer. And so, I think I think it's helpful to sort of recognize how big of a deal this is, because there's this, we almost, at Love Thy Nerd, we almost think of it like a people group. There's this people group that the church has sort of like basically ignored. And if not ignored, like kind of told, you're not really welcome. Like, if you want to come to our church and you're super into sports or like really into movies or music, like, that's all really cool. But you come in here and you start talking about how much you love Fortnite or whatever video game, is sort of like, don't you need to grow up past that? When in reality, the average gamer is 35 years old, so they're not growing up past it. They're still playing, and I want to say there's a way to engage that responsibly, and Christianly.
I want to talk about that. Your opening story of the book is You Had Me. Hello. It's I'm sure you're fired for it. Not endorsing that either. You talk about a dad who is so frustrated with his kid. He's constantly playing video games. He goes up and rips it out of his hands, smashes it to pieces, and basically says, I'm done with video games. This is not going to impact my house anymore. And without knowing it, does great damage to his relationship with his child.
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting approach that you take in becoming curious about video games rather than becoming an enemy of all video games, which alienates you from your child. Talk a little bit about how you coach parents to do that, and then hold on. Go ahead.
I mean, I just want to say I confess even this, because he was showing me that story, and I have literally never gone and watched any of our boys play a video game. But if they have a tennis match, if they have a basketball game, whatever they have, I go watch. But I've just literally never even sat down and said, show me what's happening here. And I don't know why. Like, the culture just doesn't. I think we just don't even endorse it as being an actual thing, that we don't show interest in what our kids are doing in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the stigma is understandable in one sense, because video games are a relatively new medium. I mean, they've only been around like 70 years or so compared to books or film, which has a much longer trajectory. But on the other hand, like, I think this, like, parenting really isn't nearly as complicated as we make it out to be. But I think in the church sometimes we do get some bad parenting advice. Like, I remember in my younger days, like, hearing people at church say things like, your goal as a parent is not to be the friend of your children. Like, your goal is to raise them and discipline them. And, like, I get that. Yes, we're called to discipline our children, but I think above all that, isn't the greatest commandment to love one another? And so, yeah, everything in my book, it's all about like challenging parents to do that. Love your child thoughtfully, consistently, and that means getting to know them. Getting to know what makes them tick. What are they about? I think there's a lot of parents out there that think like if my kids would just stop playing video games, I'd be a better parent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think the reality is that if that's your mentality, then the real thing that you need to work on is not your kids, it's you and your own heart, because you're struggling, and I've been there too. But you have to love the children God has given you, not the children you want them to be.
That was a profound moment when he said that we are called to love the kids that God gave us, not the ones that we want them to be. Mm-hmm. I have failed at this as a parent. Our 3 boys are not readers. I want them to read so badly. When you read a book, you go on 1,000 adventures, and I just can't, through any amount of guilt, shame, or scolding, get them interested in books on their own. Mm-hmm. And it feels like sometimes I'm swimming upstream in parenting. Do you feel that way with our kids? Like you want them to be a certain way, but they're just not.
I think we do that with almost everybody's kids. I think of some of these professional athletes. We assume that Tom Brady's son is going to have a heck of an arm. What if he's not athletic at all? Like, what do we do with that? How do we process that? What if I assume that one of our kids is going to be blank? What do we do and process when that doesn't turn out? And do we shame them? Do we make them do what we want them to do? Or do we just, like Drew said, love them for what they're interested in? That's
right. And instead of trying to make them into our own image, like really look at the image of God that's in them and embrace that, encourage that. I think about Paul's words to Timothy, fan into flame this gift of God that's within you. And God's put a flame in each of our kids. And we try so hard to change the color of that flame. But it is what it is. They are who they are. And there's a place for discipline, and there's a place for making them do things they don't want to do. But I was listening to Drew talk and thinking I should become more curious and interested in who my kids are rather than who I want them to be.
So,
what do you do when you have a kid who he's just so into gaming and you don't even have a vocabulary? I think one of the questions that you put out was very convicting. Is just to sit down and say, what's your favorite game and what do you like about it? Mm-hmm. Like show an interest in things that they're interested in. So how do you coach parents to do that without fully endorsing, boundaryless video gaming? How do you get involved? Where's that balance?
Yeah, so I think it starts with exactly what you just suggested, like ask questions and make sure you ask them honestly and genuinely, like without, like you just let them talk. Why do you like this video game? Not like, what's wrong with you? There's a pretext to that.
Matters.
Yeah.
What do you like about this game?
Yeah.
Sounds a lot different than, hey, what do you like about this game?
Yeah. And then make a real effort to listen. I think listening so often is how we best love people. People feel cared for. We know this. It's funny. We know this about our neighbors. It's like you go hang out with your neighbor and they're like really into whatever, like Formula One racing or something, and you don't care about it at all. And they just start going off about how much they love racing. And this last race that was this last weekend, and it was so exciting. You may not be into it, but you make an effort, right? Mm-hmm. To be like, okay, well, how did you get into this? And why does it matter to you? If you care about that neighbor, want to build a relationship, you'll do those things. It's the same with our kids. If we just say, like, you may not care at all about Minecraft, but tell me why you like it. And if you'll listen carefully, you'll probably pick up on some things that are actually like good and beautiful about their interest in that you can celebrate and you can encourage even, while still coming alongside them and saying, like, because if you have that curious conversation where you're genuinely curious and interested and learning about them, learning who your child is and what they're into, then when you need to have the conversation is like, hey, let's set some limits because I don't want you playing Minecraft 6 hours a day. Like, I think you need other hobbies. I think you need to get outside. Like, I think you need to we need to make sure you're socializing with other kids, which is another stereotype about gaming. Most kids are gaming socially a lot of the time these days. But that's another discussion. But yeah, so if you'll just be curious and interested, then when you have the conversation about, hey, let's set some boundaries, they'll be more game for that. They'll be more interested and accessible to that discussion.
I have a question from a completely, like, I say ignorant mom, in that I just don't know about this topic much. So you talk about it being really a social game. And I noticed over COVID, our boys played a lot with friends. And I mean, it was kind of a lifeline for them because it was a way to still maintain those relationships. But I do know the opposite side of that, of moms who are like, well, they're not playing interactive games because they're going to play with some, stranger across the world who, is going to teach them dirty things, whatever.
Sure.
Like, how is there a way to monitor that?
Yeah, but we don't want you playing with just anyone because the world is a big, scary place, for sure. So yeah, that the reality of the way kids are gaming these days is very interactive. It is, or very social. Most kids are playing games online with other friends, and it's a big part of the way that they develop socially because, just play itself, I think, is a beautiful and God-given gift. I'm not talking about video games, but just playing games, playing on the playground are a big part of how we develop and grow as human beings. And the cool thing about video games is that it takes that concept of play and makes it much more accessible. So you don't have to get up and drive to a playground. You don't have to, like with sports, there's a lot of times you need referees or you need coaches and you need certain equipment. With video games, as long as you probably already bought a device, you probably already own a device that you can play them on. And so you just turn it on. And
like
boom.
An instant playground.
An instant playground, an instant place to socialize, develop, creatively problem solve, build relationships in the context of a shared experience. And so it's that part of it can be really wonderful and beautiful. But yeah, the other part is that playgrounds can be scary places. Like they are also places where kids get picked on and bullied, and we want to avoid that, right? So the good news is that just about every platform on which you can play a video game these days has parental controls. And so there are ways to control who your child can and cannot interact with. So most of them you can set up to where you approve their friend list, and also they can only chat verbally, or even, I think even by text, with people that are on their friends list. So if a random person jumps into their game, they won't be able to communicate with them.
I want to talk about the way you push back on some of the modern theologians who have called video games a waste of time.
Sure.
This was my favorite part of the book because I felt convicted. You make the claim in the book that at least one person said if you take all the hours kids are playing in video games and have them do something productive, it could change the world.
Yeah.
But
right.
we don't say that about sports. We don't say that about even reading novels or fiction.
Learning music.
Watching movies. Like, I think on any given Saturday, I can sit on a couch and burn at least 10 hours watching college football.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
if my kid does that in a video game, I'm judging them.
Yeah.
You know?
Uh-huh.
We do have a propensity to miss the plank in our own eye. We waste time on stuff all the time. We're hard on gamers.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it probably goes back to that whole thing of it being a new medium. And I think the church, to stereotype a little bit, has a long track record of like sort of judging things that they don't understand. And so that's the thing about video games is like there's a generation of parents and just people in the church in general who didn't grow up playing these things regularly. The guy I mentioned in the opening of the book, like, grew up playing baseball. That was his thing. He didn't, he rode his bike around his neighborhood and played baseball with his friends. That's how he spent his summers. And so the idea of his children spending their summers on screens is like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
Right. But it's a lack of understanding. And I think we also need to build up our vocabulary about the importance of doing things that aren't productive. Like, we're commanded in the Bible to take a day, at least a day a week, where we cease from productivity, where we stop doing things that produce money or that put food on the table. And that's an act of worship and trust of the Lord that if we'll do that, he'll still provide for us. And it's a gift from him too, where he says, I don't want your life to be just about productivity and work. I want your life to be about rest. And so, yeah, I think God is the author of play and fun. And I think even in creation, we see God enjoying himself. I mean, everything he makes, he says, that thing I just made, it's good. It's really good. And so we need to learn how to enjoy creation without like constantly worrying, oh, am I not being productive enough? Like, did I not produce enough today? And we need to help our children develop that vocabulary too, so that they know like when they've enjoyed themselves too much as well.
Yeah.
You know,
it's like any form of recreation. You know, the word recreation means recreate. When we participate in certain activities, we feel recreated. We feel refreshed. For one guy, it's mountain biking, and he can ride that bike too much.
Yeah.
So
I have that problem.
Destroying his family.
Sure.
And we can play video games too much, and we can be on social media too much. But there are good things that can be found in all these things if they're used in the right proportion.
Well,
That's right.
I want to add to the too much, because you said something a second ago that we can idolize the past too much. In that you said, you know, the kind of the good old days back when we played on the playground. Well, there have been children abducted from playgrounds. I mean, there have been bullying. And so, like, I think sometimes we think, oh, back in the innocent days when children played outside and rode their bikes and stuff, like as if there was never harm in any of that. And you talk about bullying. I mean, yeah, like they're bullied face to face. So, you know, I think that me particularly.
That's a good point. There's no place where kids can't get hurt.
That's right.
They can get hurt on a physical playground like they can get hurt in a virtual playground. So we can't fully protect them, but we can be dialed in. Yeah. And that's what I really love about your book. It challenged me. We have a son that's a musician. He's constantly in his room playing guitar. I read your book, and I actually went up that night and laid on the bed and said, play me something.
Oh, cool.
And I could tell it really meant a lot to him that I just sat there as an audience of one and took an interest in his music. It's a basic relationship skill. And I think one of the reasons ministry families especially need this conversation is that we get so consumed by the stuff at the church. We're constantly doing church. Lindley and I, when we were church planning, every lunch was a staff meeting. We would just figure out how to fix something in the church. And before long, the kids feel like all our life is fixing church stuff.
Yep.
Like, Dad's no fun. Like, all he wants to talk about is deacons. And I want to talk about my new, system.
Yeah.
And so I think in ministry, too, it's easy to put your kids at the end of the table and ignore them and not take an interest in them. And we need to engage in what they're interested in.
Your kids need to know you're not ashamed of them. And I think that's the message so often we send with video games is like, we put up with it, but we're also kind of like, a lot of parents struggle with getting little jabs in about like, yeah, I'll let you play that game, but I want you to know I think it's stupid, and I want you to know, like, I wish you were doing something else, rather than like, I love who you are right now, period. End of discussion. You're a gamer. I love you so much. Tell me why that matters to you.
Yeah. And I feel convicted when you say that because I wear my kids out. I'm like, hey, go play video games and waste your brain. That's great. That's a good idea, guys. I'm glad that you don't
I've done it too.
So you never have to lead anything because readers are leaders. That kind of stuff. And it doesn't seem to be working very well, Drew.
Well, I'm glad
I need to read the rest of your book.
Yeah, I'm glad we're here then.
Hobbies is a great discussion for family and for ministry families. Pastors seem to be poor at having a hobby outside of the church, but we as parents are often hypocrites. We tell our kids, you can't have this hobby, or if you have that hobby, it needs to be in proper balance. And yet we struggle to keep balance in our own hobbies. I mean, how many guys do I know that golf all the time, that hunt all the time, not just for 9 holes, 18 holes, 36 holes. And our kids, we see them doing things to a high proportion and we judge them for it.
Well, I think we were talking about hobbies and also the hypocrisy of wasting time. I mean, as a mother, there's not a day that goes by that I don't say to one of my kids, I feel like you're just wasting time doing this. Never mind that I'll sit on Instagram and watch my 5 top favorite influencers give me the latest Target deal that I don't need. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need another piece of clothing, but it's a good deal. And so I'm just sitting there wasting my time on there.
The book of Ecclesiastes lays this out, the pursuit of pleasure. the eye never has enough seeing, the ear never has enough hearing. Our kids struggle with that, no doubt. And as parents, we have to help them, but we struggle with that. Lindley, there's times where you'll confront me. Why are you spending so much time on blank? And I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
I just feel like this is what I want to do right now.
Well, we were even just talking about last night, for instance, when Jack and I were laying on the couch watching the U.S. Open. We love to do that together. There was probably 4 shots in a row that he looked over at me and said, "Did you see that?" I mean, he was so excited. And every time I was on my phone, and by the 4th time, he just said, "You keep missing all the good things playing on your phone." And yet I gripe at them all the time for, their screen time, whatever that even means. Their screen time is such kind of an elusive term. Are we talking about gaming? Are we talking about TVs? Are we talking about phones? Because if we're talking about all of it, then I am the worst at probably the worst in our family about being on our screens.
And when I get bitter toward our kids for doing something out of proportion, if I'm walking in the Holy Spirit, I take the plank out of my own eye and think, what are all the areas in my life right now that I'm wasting time, where I'm not doing things in balance, that I'm being selfish? There's a lot of areas too. We all need the gospel. We're all broken.
Well, I just think about what the world celebrates, because I have never seen a post about my child just won blank. I mean, maybe, I don't even know if there are like video game competitions.
Oh,
yes.
There's scholarships that you can gain to colleges now for esports.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, but we don't talk about that. Like, really, the only thing we can put out there is if your child's a really great athlete, if they're a really great actor, musician, all those kind of things. And so I do think it's sad. We've had this frustration before. You can't praise your child for being very academic and smart, because you get kind of shamed for that. You can't praise them if they're into gaming, because they get shamed for that. I mean, it's just kind of like this weird adult bullying that we don't talk about of, oh, your kid's a gamer, or, your kid just likes to read. That's boring or whatever.
Yep.
And I think kids, just like adults, struggle with the snare of compare. And when a kid has a brother that's an athlete and he loves video games, in this society, that's a tough thing.
Yep.
To feel like you're unique and special in your own way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've got to figure out how to foster those things, celebrate our children, just period. Whatever they're into, let's get behind it. Well, I think it's also important to get behind it in the right way, because I think about the sports thing as maybe a good counterexample. There's a lot of unhealthy relationships amongst parents and their kids with regard to sports,
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
A lot.
That's another episode.
Yeah. I mean, I used to be in student ministry, and that drove me. I've gotten so many fights with parents over sports, because I was like, I really want your child to come with us to camp this summer. And they're like, well, we have football all summer. And it's because it's not sports are not just in their season anymore.
It's not in moderation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I was a little probably too bold in some ways. And I'd be like, well, what kind of message do you think you're sending to your son when you always choose football or soccer over the church? And so, I think that's a whole big problem in our culture, I think. And, we've got to, I think we need to help our kids with that with regard to video games too. These things can be wonderful, but is your kid really going to spend his entire life playing baseball? I mean, yeah, unless they're super good. They might be a coach one day or something like that, or they might play in college, but more likely than not, they're not even going to play in college, And yet we're giving all this time and money and energy and attention to their baseball.
That's not going to yield any fruit when they're adults, really.
Yeah, except for the friendships and things maybe that they build along the way and some of the socialization. But those things can be done in all kinds of spaces, even video games.
Yeah.
So let's help kids develop healthy relationships with all kinds of hobbies that they might be into, without lifting it up as this thing that's going to satisfy them, because it's not.
I want you to counsel a pastor and his wife who are listening to this show. They're very involved in ministry. Their kid comes to church, but he seems nominally interested. He's really into games.
Yeah.
They feel like they might even use the term losing him to video games.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to fit in the church because none of the other kids are into his games. What do you say to a family like that who has a kid who marches to the beat of a different drum, likes different things, but they don't know how to relate to them? What do you say to that?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely go back to what we talked about earlier. Start by asking questions, like honest questions. Get to know your son or daughter and why they're really into video games. And then secondly, I would say like get in the game yourself. Like it was really meaningful, I imagine, to your son when you sat down and was like, play me something on your guitar. How meaningful would it be to your child if you said, let's play together? Like, teach me. You're going to be terrible. You're going to get destroyed. You might not even have that much fun. But, like, you're entering their world. And you're giving them an opportunity to be, to be the master and you be the learner. You know, you're being discipled by them in a sense.
Oh, listen, I tried to play Halo with my boys once, and they still laugh about it to this day, how horrible that is at Halo.
And see, that's a great example, though, because they remember that.
They do.
Like, even though it was, like, probably kind of embarrassing for you. Like,
I couldn't, like, there's too many buttons.
Yeah.
Like, too many controls. Like,
yeah.
I'm not that good at multitasking. Like, I miss the day when Nintendo had 2 buttons.
Mm-hmm.
You were, like, hopping over things on Mario.
Yeah.
It's a whole different world now.
So I think we've got to prioritize relationship first and prioritize love. Like, my goal as a parent, remind yourself again and again and again, my goal is to love my child. When we prioritize relationship and love, then we can come in and say, like, hey, what do you think a responsible, like, healthy relationship with video games should look like? You can sit around at the table, and I encourage this in the book. There's a whole section on, like, developing screen time rules in your home. And there's, by the way, there's not like one size fits all solution to that. I think every child, every family is different. You need to find one that works for you. I give several examples of how you can do this, but in the way you develop them, I think it's important to involve your children. So you can even start the conversation by saying, tell me what you think. How much time do you think you should get to play video games every week?
Let's negotiate.
Yeah. And that sounds scary to some parents because you think they're going to say, well, I should just get to play them whenever I want. But you'd be surprised that I think if you've built some collateral relationally, if you've made an effort to understand why they like video games, they're probably not going to say all day, every day as much as I want. They'll probably give some kind of answer that's almost reasonable, and you can work from there and you can develop. But if you need to go into that conversation knowing, like, here's what I want for them. Let's see what they think. But involve them in the rules. If they feel like they're a part of the process of developing the screen time guidelines in your home, then I think they're going to be more likely to respect them, and they'll more likely respect it when you say, hey, time's up. You need to turn it off.
We agreed on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's time to read or go outside or whatever. And like in our home, they've got to do those things before they get on the games. They got to spend some time outside, spend some time reading, as long as it's not like the horrible Middle Tennessee winter when it rains.
Oh,
cold.
Don't even
But
get me started on the horrible
really
winter.
depressing.
Yeah, 3 months of rain.
Yeah.
As I think through this, and I know I'm starting to understand what our listeners, how they respond. If somebody were to respond and say, you guys just talked about this in such broad generalities, what about shooting games? What about, all these, this uptick in mass shootings everywhere? Is this attributed to video games?
Great question.
Yeah.
And so I still feel like that is an unclear thing. I mean, do you have any guidelines on, I know they have parental guidelines on the things, on each video game, but I just think it's just, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to answer.
Yeah. So there's a whole chapter of the book called Games Are Broken, where I get into the biggest fears that most parents have about video games. So one of those is violence. The other one is addiction. Like, what if my kid gets addicted? Those are the two big fears I think that parents have about video games.
I would add a third: sensuality.
Yes, and I get into that too.
That they often wear, like even in Fortnite, the outfits are super tight.
Yes. Yeah.
On the guys and the girls.
Yep. And so I get into that too in that chapter. There's a lot of research actually now about violence in video games, and the conclusion essentially is that we don't really know yet what the effect is, but we also know that it's not the thing that's tipping us over into being a violent culture. In fact, more mass shooters are not video gamers than are, actually. But anyway, this is not the goal. This is not to say, but I do think they have an effect because like anything we consume is going to have some kind of effect on us. So we need to be very careful as parents about what we do and don't let our kids get into. And so, yeah, the ESRB.org is a great place to start. That's the governing body that rates video games.
Say that again. Just
ESRB.org.
Okay.
So,
and do you mention in the book also about just certain games and their frequency?
Sure.
Because I can also see a kid playing a game, but maybe not. He doesn't play that game as much as other games in proportion.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about that with movies. Like there's certain things we want our kids to see that maybe tend toward violent, but we want them to see the story, so we're willing to handle all the other stuff. Maybe with video games, there's a way to negotiate that too.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, let me mention a couple other resources that I think are helpful for understanding what kind of content games have. So ESRB is great, but I really like Common Sense Media, which is not a Christian site, but commonsensemedia.org is a great place to go because you get very detailed reviews about what's in a game. And so some of those are written from like a critic perspective, and then some of them are written actually by parents. And so you'll have a parent, they'll say, I'm a parent of a 10-year-old. We played this game together. Here's what's in it. So very informative. And then a third really helpful way to know whether or not you should let your kid play various games is Twitch. Twitch is an online streaming service. That's probably the wrong way to put it because you think Netflix. But this is different. This is where you go watch people play games live, video games live. So your kids probably love Twitch, and you may not even know it.
Yeah, I think it's YouTube they watch. They love to watch other people playing games.
Yeah, and that's done on YouTube as well. Yeah, Twitch is the biggest kind of deal amongst nerds and gamers for a place to go watch. But if you just get on twitch.com and search for whatever game your kid is wanting to play, you can go watch someone else play it. And even just watching someone else play it for like 5 minutes, you're going to get an idea of what kind of content's there. You're going to see if it's like ultra violent. You're going to see if there's lots of offensive language. You'll get a sense of like, yay or nay, whether I want my kid to play this game.
That's interesting.
It's really interesting you bring that up about watching video games because during COVID, of course, our kids wanted to play a lot, and we had a certain amount of time. We had to start saying, hey, the time includes you watching your brother play the game.
Because they would just like trade off.
Yep.
Like, oh, it's your hour. I'm going to watch you during your hour.
And then along the way, they've introduced us to certain phenoms on YouTube that are nationally known. Game who are celebrities.
Yep.
It's a whole culture now. Can we talk about grown men gamers for a moment?
Sure.
As being a pastor for years, I was in more than one counseling situation where a couple was dealing with the frustration of he's constantly gaming. I had a staff member along the way that I had to talk to about, hey, people are saying you're gaming too much.
Yeah.
More than you're working.
More than you're working. The perception in the church is that you're gaming too much. How would you encourage a marriage situation where gaming seems to be taking over?
Yeah, so I've definitely experienced that firsthand because when my wife and I met, I was not gaming. I was in seminary, and I was a good student. And then a few years into our marriage was really when I got back into it, and she was kind of like, I didn't know this is who you were. Like, I didn't. She kind of felt a little betrayed, like I didn't sign up for this. And I think it's give and take there because I think we need to understand. If your spouse is a gamer and you're not, you need to understand that what they're into is not evil. Games are one of God's good gifts to us. And like all of God's good gifts, we are really adept at exploiting them in ways that harm ourselves and our neighbors. And so if a husband or wife is playing video games too much, you're harming that relationship.
It's an idol.
Yeah, it's an idol. It's something that's not helping you thrive. It's causing harm. And in those instances, you need to reevaluate and step back. And what does a healthy relationship with this medium look like? You would say the same thing to a spouse who was just like spending all their time watching Hallmark movies or something.
Or golfing. Or hunting.
Over-exercising.
Yeah.
Facebooking. All kinds of things.
Right, yeah. And I think honestly, that's the bigger draw these days is scrolling endlessly on our phones through Instagram or Facebook. That's the biggest temptation that a lot of couples face. But yeah, I think you both need to come to the table with open arms and make an effort. Both of you need to make an effort to understand each other. How can I accept my husband or wife as a gamer, while also expecting them reasonably, of course, to like prioritize the family and the home and your children and the life you're building together, to make that come first. I think like we complicate it more than we need to, but it's the same conversation we ought to be having about all kinds of things. Yeah.
Well, it's proactive. I mean, we talk about that with so many topics on here. Like anything that is proactively discussed always heads off a conflict. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if that's beginning to be a thing, to just have a proactive conversation to say, this is important to me. How much do you feel like is okay that before you get resentful? I mean, then that's a conversation. And when he plays for an hour, then I say, great, this is his hour or whatever.
Yeah.
It is amazing as adults how often we have at least I do, the thought of, I used to be a human being before I had all these family responsibilities.
Or work. Just work.
I mean, right now with teenagers, I drive the car
Yeah.
all the time. Lily is in the car all the time. And we start to feel resentful of like, man, I need hobbies too.
Yeah.
I need things that bring me refreshment.
Gosh, me too. I need some hobbies.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And for some guys, like I know one guy, like his lunch hour at work, he games. Like it's his release.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in a place in life right now where like, gosh, I'd love to play a video game. Like it would be so nice. But my lunch hour is spent doing accounting problems. Because I'm working on an MBA. So, I would love to play. It would be amazing to have time to play video games. But all that to say, like, we all need that outlet.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the ways you love your spouse too, is by letting them have things that are their thing and respecting that, and learning to like, both of you engaging those things responsibly. Like I know my wife, like I made the Hallmark movie joke before. She actually really does love Hallmark
It's
movies.
her outlet.
Yeah. And she does, like, I'll sit down and watch them with her sometimes, and sometimes that's okay. But sometimes she's like, you can't watch this with me right now because you're going to make fun of it. And that's going to like kill the vibe for me.
Yeah.
So.
And there's many couples who fight over his or her addiction to a hobby. Many more fight over an addiction to work. We are always finding ourselves addicted. The New Testament says, be careful of the little idols.
Yeah.
And so I think marriage, what's difficult about it is you're constantly having the conversation about how will I spend my free time in a way that's fair to you, to me, to the kids. And gaming just adds one more piece of the conversation.
Oh, yeah.
I do want you to speak to one thing that you describe in the book, which I found fascinating. You do make a distinction between just sitting in front of a screen consuming content and gaming.
Yeah.
You find those to be two different parts of the brain, I think. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think not all screen time is created equal. I think that's really important. Like I would much rather my child be playing a video game than scrolling through Instagram. Way more. I'd probably rather them be talking to their grandparents on FaceTime than playing a video game. Probably. Sometimes when they're talking to their grandparents on FaceTime, they're just like putting little emojis on there and they're not even really paying attention. My kids focus on themselves.
Like watching their face.
Yeah, they're like, yeah. I'm like, talk to your grandparents. Anyway, but the great thing about video games is that they're interactive. You read a book, you watch a show, you play a video game. So video games, this is the thing that scares us about video games. A lot of parents, it scares them, but it's also the thing that's the greatest thing about them is that they're interactive. You play, you're immersed, you're making decisions. So video games engage our brains in a way that other media do not. And so studies have shown that in moderation, video games are actually really good for our brain.
You know what's interesting about that? How often I hear my kids laughing when they're playing video games, or even getting fired up and excited.
Yeah.
Versus I've never seen that happen on Instagram. Where they're scrolling through and these emotions are coming out of them. Because something's being engaged in that group experience. Because our kids will play in different rooms.
Yeah.
And I've got one son in one room and another son in another room. And you can hear them like talking.
Yeah.
And there's interaction happening. And that part's encouraging.
Right.
Yeah.
Versus like watching, I mean, we talk about these things, the violence, addiction, sensuality. I mean, they'll watch any primetime show, and that's all in there. Mm-hmm. But they're not. I mean, there's not the reverse that they're not actually interacting with friends during that time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know why I think, well, it's okay for you to watch TV and watch all that, but don't play with your friends while viewing that.
Yeah, people who study video games and kind of how they work call that emergent narrative. And what it means is that the story of a video game is different from the story of a book or a movie. You're watching a story that someone crafted in a film. With video games, you're actually creating the story as you go, as you play, because your input into the system matters. And it gets even more complicated when you bring other people together to play at the same time. So like you're creating an emergent narrative. You're crafting a story together as you go. And so you'll have all these memories about, remember that time you fell in the pit and we had to pull you out or whatever, like, we got ambushed or whatever it is. And we figured out a way to get through this really difficult problem. And you'll hear, like, I remember being in college and, not necessarily endorsing Halo, but I played, we had these huge LAN parties, local area network parties, where we had cords running through my apartment and everybody in different rooms on different TVs. And after a round, we'd all get out and be like, oh, I can't believe that happened.
It's like going on a vacation together. Like you have this experience that now bonds you together.
Yeah, exactly.
We did something when we were in the church that I'm thinking about the community of nerds that go to every church of all ages. Mm-hmm. We had set up in the lobby after the services and said, hey, we've put signs in the lobby of activities that people enjoy. After the service, go to the sign that represents something you enjoy and meet the other people that go to our church and also enjoy that. Mm-hmm. So we had bike riding, we had fishing,
hiking, skiing. I mean, all the things.
And it was so cool to go out there and see people exchanging phone numbers and like, hey, we should do a ride together.
That's great.
We should do this for gamers. Like, there's a lot of people in the church that find community through gaming, and it's not helpful for us to put it aside as if it doesn't matter.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what Love Thy Nerd is all about, is just breaking those stereotypes and helping the church see that these are people to be loved, right? Gamers are people to be loved, not just to thumb our nose at them. So yeah, I think that's a great thing. If you're a church leader and you're listening to this, like, set up a hobby day where you just connect people around their hobbies and make sure you include video gamers, also include board gamers. That's a huge growing area of nerddom. And also like board games are a great like transition from video games. Like, I think if you're a parent too listening to this, I would encourage you to think about starting a game night. You'd be surprised by how many of the mechanics of video games translate really well into board games. And I love board games. We play them in our home quite a bit because they get us around the table and
shared experience.
We're looking each other in the eye. I don't like that about online video games. I love that online video games bring people together. I wish we played more in person. I wish it was more like video games that we played in the same couch. And so, I think that's a great way to be like, hey, let's play board games together. And you'd be surprised by how many of your kids would be like, okay, yeah. I mean, I think we fear they'll be like, I'm playing a board game with you. But
that's funny you mentioned that. Do you know Jeremy Hensley, who works at Lifeway?
Yeah.
He would call himself a self-proclaimed nerd.
Okay,
but
nice.
He not only loves gaming, but he and his wife go to the National Board Game Conference every year. The big convention where they roll out new board games, and like it's a whole thing for them.
Oh yeah, I've been to those too.
It's a whole culture out there. Like, when I talk to Jeremy, I'm like, this is fascinating. I didn't even know this existed. If there's a parent out there that really needs some advice and wanted to reach out to you personally, could you tell them how to get in touch with you?
Sure, yeah. I mean, probably the easiest, most public way to reach me is through Twitter _Drew Dixon, @_Drew Dixon on Twitter. But yeah, I'm not that hard to find.
Are you comfortable giving your email address out?
Yeah, I am. It's drew.dixon@lifeway.com.
That's probably the easiest way.
Sure. Yeah. If you have a question, I will either answer it as best I can or try to point you to some resources. So for sure.
Hey, love having you on the show. Very practical topic. Can't wait for our guests to enjoy this one.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.